UCB Life Issues with Paul Hammond.
And as always, a very warm welcome to this week's Life Issues. Now, many years ago, I had the opportunity and the privilege to go to Marrakesh. Sounds exotic, doesn't it? Well, it did to me. And in fairness, it was wandering through the souk in the walled city, all the smells and the sounds and the ambience that was so different to dear old Blighty, even coming face to face with Bill Clinton. But that's a story for another time. And I realised before I went that although they speak French, my CSE grade 5 wasn't going to get me very far. So I decided to learn a little bit of Arabic. I learned how to say no in a way that wouldn't offend. I practiced my shukran, which is thank you. I even mastered a greeting, assalamu alaikum. I learnt gestures that meant sincerity and gratitude. My wife bought a scarf to cover her head, which brought nods of approval from the women in the square, who were equally tutting at the more holiday-dressed tourists. And why did we do that? Not because we expected to be taken for locals, but we felt it was right to make at least some effort to respect local language, local values, local culture. And of course in Morocco, that is predominantly Muslim. So if I did that going on holiday, shouldn't I, especially as a follower of the Prophet Isa, Jesus, make the same effort for the Muslims who live in my street, in my town, work in my office, drive my taxi? Effort to understand a little more, connect a little more meaningfully, and show the love, grace, power, and truth of Isa wherever I go, who he is, what he has done, and how his message is for all. This week, our Life Issues asks, how do I connect my faith with my Muslim neighbours? And does the call to be a witness come with an exemption clause when you're talking to a Muslim? My guest is Dr. Andy Bannister. He is the director of Solas, and among many other roles, he is also the adjunct research fellow at the Centre for the Study of Islam and Other Faiths at Melbourne School of Theology. He also numbers amongst his books one entitled Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? So do they, Andy?
Well, thanks for that introduction, Paul. And what a great question. And the funny thing is, when that book came out last year, Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? It was amazing that I got two sort of opposite reactions on social media. I had some people jumping on me saying, "Why on earth do you have to publish that book?" The answer is obviously no. And another bunch of people jumping on me saying, "Why have you published that book?" The answer is obviously yes. The fact that there were the two opposite reactions told me it was a conversation to have here. Yeah. So that to get the longer answer, Paul, people need to buy the book. Otherwise, if I just told them the answer, IVP will come after me with a sharp stick. But in a nutshell, the answer, I'm going to be a bit naughty and say the answer is 85% no and 15% yes. So to unpack what I mean, the question has a lot of things built into it to me to sort of unpack it slightly. If we ask the question in a slightly revised way, if we say, does the Quran describe the same God as the God of the Bible? I think the answer is a categoric no. My expertise academically is the Quran. My PhD is in Quranic studies. When you dive into Quranic theology and you look at the nature of God in the Quran, compare it with the nature of God in the Bible, very, very different. And if you want to, we can press into that in a moment. However, do you meet Muslims who, in their own way, are striving to reach out for the God of the Bible? I think you do. And a good example of this would be that one of the categories that's absolutely different between the Quran and the Bible is the Quran is very clear that God is not a God of love. That is not a term described to God applied to God in the Quran. Whereas, of course, the God of the Bible is a God of love. That's made clear time and time again. When I meet Muslims who tell me they are interested in, they are drawn to, they believe in a God of love, rather than turn around and go, no, you don't, you got it wrong, I will always try and say to them, look, I agree with you. God is a God of love, but the God you're describing, the God you're reaching out for, that's the God of the Bible. Let me tell you more about him. In other words, I'm doing what Paul does in Acts 17 in Athens with the altars of the unknown God. So there are definitely Muslims who are reaching out, who are yearning for the God of the Bible, even though at that point he may be the unknown God. They may not know who he is. And they're the ones I particularly want to reach out and embrace and say, come on home. But does the Quran describe the same God? No.
So where are the similarities then? Because I mean, in my introduction, I mentioned the fact that the reference to the prophet Isa is Jesus in the idea, the panoply of Islam. And there is a reference about respecting the people of the book and respecting the book as well, which is the Bible, the scriptures of both Judaism and Christianity. So where is the crossover and where is there confusion? Not in terms of an exhaustive study, but just some hints.
Well, let me give you a 90-minute lecture. There's definitely a lot of confusion. And of course, that confusion is sown by the fact that the Quran uses the same words we use as Christians and often means quite different things by them. And in fact, the one question, what part of your first question I didn't actually answer was, you said, why does it matter? Well, I think it matters because obviously, as Christians, we talk to our Muslim friends. They say they believe in God. We say we believe in God. The trap is that you can fall into is assuming it's the same. Whenever I meet a Muslim or a person of any other faith, actually, who uses the word God, I always want to say, oh, great. Yeah, tell me about God. What kind of God do you believe in? What is God like to you? Where there are similarities, absolutely affirm them. Where there are differences, say, well, that's interesting. We believe something different. Isa is a case in point, actually. I'm really glad you mentioned that because I did think about that during your introduction. Obviously, the Quran does talk about Jesus. He's mentioned by name about 20 times. And he's mentioned in general about 90 times. And Isa is the Arabic word used there in the Quran for Jesus. That's for a long time caused scholars lots of confusion because that's not a straightforward Arabization of Jesus's name, because Jesus in Hebrew, of course, is Yeshua, and that there's the equivalent to that in Arabic. It's not Isa, and there's no end of debate. I don't think scholars are ever going to figure out what the answer is. Isa is actually closer to the Arabic name Esau. And there's one theory that it was Muhammad actually asked the Jews, who do the Christians worship? And the Jews, who had obviously were at loggerheads with the Christians in Arabia, simply said, oh, yeah, they worship Esau. They worship Isa. And Muhammad didn't know what he was talking about. But what I would say is that the Jesus in the Quran is a sort of cardboard cutout compared to the full-blooded figure of the Gospels. The Jesus of the Quran, we know very little about him. The Quran tells us he did some miracles. It tells us he taught people. The Quran's very interested in the virgin birth. There are 2 extended virgin birth stories. Not a lot of detail. We're told he's crucified, but the Jews didn't succeed in killing him, and there's nothing about the resurrection. And the difference is actually, it's such, I think, a sort of shallow presentation. I'm always very careful of saying, I think as Christians, we need to be careful about using the word Isa, because Isa implies in the Muslim mind the Isa of the Quran, who is quite different from the Jesus of the Bible, both theologically and in fact historically, because there are 700 years almost 700 years between the Gospels and the time of the Quran. And the Quran is written in a different culture, different time, different place by someone who knew nothing about the biblical Jesus other than a few bits and pieces secondhand. So again, it's another area where we get a bit sort of suckered by the fact that Muslims say they believe in Jesus. So what I want to do an Acts 17 with Muslims and say, hey, the Quran talks about the teaching of Jesus. Do you know the things he taught? And most Muslims aren't aware of them. Say, well, would you be interested in hearing one of the stories that Jesus taught? He liked to teach in parables. And then, of course, you're into the Bible. So I would say we want to start with perhaps the terminology that's in common: God, Jesus, prophets, sin, revelation, scripture. Ask our Muslim friends what they believe about those things, but find ways to build bridges from those over to the Bible. Because particularly when it comes to God, Paul, I would say once you get beyond which is the stuff that is implied, simply once you say you believe in one powerful creator God, obviously that implies a few things, whatever you believe. Once you get beyond those very bare essentials, Islam is an utterly different faith tradition. And I don't say that to be derogatory or negative. Actually, in one sense, I say it to respect Islam and the Quran and to go, we need to let it be its own thing, not try and force it into a Christian frame.
And it seems to me that the way that you do your work, the way that you write your books, the way that you do your ministry, and I know that you've spoken at many sort of debate type environments, but it does seem to me that you believe it's important for us to have conversations with those around us who follow not just Islam, but other faiths as well, to actually not just proclaim to them the truth that they might hear, but actually listen to their perspective as well.
Yeah, it's funny you should say this, because this morning I was busy working away because I've got COVID as we record this. So I'm sort of restrained to confined to barracks, and so I was working away my next book, and I'm writing a chapter in this book on evangelism, on the importance of friendships and character. And I tell a couple of stories in there, because amazing things happen when we're willing to actually build friendships across the barriers. So on the Muslim side of things, when I was in Canada, I lived in Canada before I moved back to the UK. And one of the last things I did before I came back to the UK in 2016 was I and another Christian friend did this big dialogue event at one of the local mosques, one of the biggest mosques in Toronto, actually. And we had 1,000 people out that night, 600 Muslims, 400 Christians. Amazing event, 2 hours of speeches and then 3 hours of Q&A. It was a long old evening. And some Muslims came to Christ, actually, as a result of that event. But what is fun, that event, that huge dialogue event, had started about 9 years before, when one of the associate pastors at the church that was involved in it was in a local shopping centre. He'd gone into, a sort of heel bar or something to get his shoes repaired, got chatting to the guy behind the counter who was a Muslim. And they hit it off. They got on quite well. So they started meeting for coffee and discussing the Bible and the Quran, built a friendship, I think played sport together, became really good friends. And during the course of that, realized that his mosque and his church were like 2 blocks away from each other. So they hit upon this idea of, why don't we start a dialogue event and get our peoples talking? And the first one, I think, had about 100 people in it. And by about year 5 or 6, it had grown so big it couldn't fit in the church anymore because it was alternating venues. So they agreed to just have it in the Muslim mosque because it was bigger. And then by the time I came along and did one of the events for them, they got to 1,000. And that had all started, and there was all kinds of fruit from that. It all started because a Christian befriended a Muslim that he met while getting his shoes repaired. And so I think amazing things can happen.
And some people would say, it's good to befriend people of other faiths so that we can tell them our truth. And while telling them our truth is absolutely critical, I get a sense from the way that you shape it that actually friendship for friendship's sake is the foundation that we build, not friendship as a means to an end.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is, I think if you form a friendship for friendship's sake, and you are a Christian who is living out what it means to be an ambassador of Christ, and we all make mistakes, no one's perfect, so I don't want people hearing that you have to be perfect like you are, Paul. To go, you're nodding, that worries me. We fumble our way through life, we make mistakes, because that's what grace is all about. Then actually Jesus will naturally spill over into those friendships. And I think actually it works better, almost, evangelism, when people see that you really, really care about them. Because I think you're right, there are 2 mistakes that we can fall into as Christians. One is we just see people as evangelism fodder, and they quickly see through that. And I think I've met people who are very suspicious of Christians because they feel like they've been adopted as a project. The other mistake is to go the other way, incidentally, and be so concerned about being friends that you never dare mention anything about your faith because you're afraid that you'll damage the friendship. The middle ground is going, how do I reach out to those around me, build genuine friendships with people right across the spectrum of beliefs, and weave Jesus naturally into those. Be a natural Christian, and don't be afraid of bringing Jesus in. But also, if your friends, you've been friends for 10, 15 years with somebody and they don't show any signs of coming closer to Christ, you don't drop them off the next bridge and move on to the next project. You're in there for the long term. And of course, I think that there's many places in the scriptures that I think talk about this. One of my favorite verses is, Matthew 5, where Jesus talks about Christians being salt and light. And the salt piece is interesting, of course, because, as you probably know, in the ancient world, salt was a preservative. It was before people had invented refrigerators or fast food restaurants, discovered you could make food out of plastic. And, we preserve things with salt. But salt had to have contact to do its effect.
Yes.
And I think there's something about Christianity that has to have contact, sometimes prolonged contact, to have that kind of preservative and transformative effect. And of course, Jesus modeled this. I always say, look at the people that Jesus hung out with. I mean, he hung out with tax collectors, he hung out with, Pharisees, he hung out with prostitutes and drunkards. Even in his close-knit circle of disciples, we had James and John who were always killing each other. We had Matthew the tax collector. We had Simon the zealot. The zealots were terrorists. So Jesus modeled this for us. And of course, he had Judas, who ultimately let the side down. Now, Jesus knew what was going to happen. He didn't throw Judas off the bus, even though he knew what was going to happen. So maybe there's something in there about the way that Jesus treated people that we can learn from.
So why is it, do you think? Because in my introduction, I mentioned that many Christians kind of hope that there's an exemption clause to the command to make disciples and to preach the gospel to all nations, that actually, if I'm talking to my Muslim neighbour, I think there's an exemption clause in terms of sharing my faith and witnessing to them. Why do we so often shy away from trying to actively reach out to Muslims?
The funny thing is here, Paul, the funny thing is I'll say a couple of words about why I think we're afraid. Muslims are some of the easiest because, look, if you've got a friend at work or a neighbor or someone you hang out with who's an atheist or a skeptic or an agnostic or just a sort of average run-of-the-mill sort of nominal Brit, starting conversations can be quite tough. With a Muslim, it's not difficult. I've always say to people, the way you start a conversation with a Muslim is simply to say, hey, forgive me for asking, but you're a Muslim, right? They're not going to say no because they're quite usually very confident in their faith. And you say, I'm a Christian. I don't know much about Muslims. Tell me, what do you believe? And you're off. And you just ask questions. And eventually there'll come a time where they probably ask you what you believe, or there's a very natural point in the conversation where you can say, this is fascinating because, I'm a follower of Jesus. We believe some different things. It's not difficult. The reasons, though, I think we find evangelism in general tough, twofold, really. Firstly, we've allowed the culture to tell us that faith is a private thing. So many of us have privatized our faith. Here in the UK, it's generally acceptable to be religious, but you do that at home. You don't take that into the public square, be that work, university, wherever. Faith goes on in the four walls of your home. And I think we've bought into that. And one of the things I think actually we can learn from Muslims are pretty good actually at not being private about their faith, right down to the way they dress, the way they are. I really admire that, actually. And I think we could learn a lesson from our friends there. So I think the privatization of faith. And then secondly, the fear thing. It's fear that holds us back. I think back to when I was in the secular workplace for some years. Why did I not share my faith very actively? I didn't. I came into that later in life. I was afraid. I was afraid of what people would say. I was afraid of looking stupid. I was afraid of making God look bad. I was afraid of perhaps getting in trouble in my career, running into issues, afraid of standing out from the crowd, afraid of being asked a question I didn't answer. And in fact, the book I'm writing right now, which is due out for release next year, is called How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. And it's hopefully a kind of, bluffer's guide to evangelism. But it starts that whole question of fear, why we're afraid, and some ways we can overcome that.
Yes, you don't shy away from thought-provoking titles for your books, do you? Is part of the thing that we... I wondered if when we think about sharing faith with somebody from the Muslim faith, part of the problem is that we carry unhelpful assumptions about Islam, and that colours our fear or colours our hesitancy. Yeah,
I would definitely agree with that. I mean, one, of course, we've touched on a little bit. If somebody's labouring under the sort of misconception that Islam and Christianity are essentially the same, that Muslims are like Baptists but just with beards and burqas, then obviously that's going to hinder your evangelism, because you're going to feel a bit of a jerk, really, for these guys are basically the same as us. Why am I sharing my faith with them? Isn't that terribly arrogant and post-colonial and all kinds of things? So there's that issue. The other way I think that Christians sometimes go, particularly in perhaps more conservative ends of the church, is we can sort of pick up this idea that's still around in the not as widespread as it was, but still around in the culture, that Muslims are basically extremists and they're a group to be afraid of and fearful. Sometimes for Christians who love their country, we get our politics and our theology a little bit too close together. Our American friends do this quite a lot, but we're not immune from this in the UK. So the whole immigration thing comes in where, if we're concerned about, over immigration and the way the country's changing, and then that gets sucked in even subconsciously into how we view our Muslim friends. Rather than, as I say, on that one, I often say to people, look, whatever you think about immigration, it's perfectly okay as a Christian to have views and discuss that issue as long as you do it in a friendly way. What I would say is Jesus did say, go and make disciples of all nations. And it used to be the case that was quite expensive. Now he's saved us the airfare by bringing them all here. So I think it's an amazing privilege, actually, that you can share the gospel with different nations just by walking down the street in many parts of the UK. Maybe we should see it as an opportunity rather than as a threat.
Do flip side of that coin then, do Muslims
Yes.
sometimes have unhelpful assumptions about Christians? And if so, how do we tackle those? Because I get a sense that for many Muslims, including Muslims that are sort of second, third generation here in the UK, the westernized impression that they have of Christianity can be hurtful to the truth that we're trying to convey.
I think you're absolutely right. And in fact, there's a talk I sometimes do called Mutual Misconceptions Between Muslims and Christians. And in fact, I remember sort of COVID messes with your head space and diaries. I think about 3 years ago, I had the privilege of actually being asked by the Islamic Society at Edinburgh University to come and do that talk, because they were doing some, quote unquote, interfaith stuff, and they'd landed on me. And basically in that talk, I start by talking about where Christians have misconceptions. So the ones I've just mentioned, I talk about the fact that, believing that all Muslims are extremists, a misunderstanding how Islam and politics fit together, because Muslims do collapse religion and politics together, and misunderstanding the place of Muhammad, and therefore misunderstanding why Muslims get so upset when they perceive them to be insulted. But then I flip it over and go, now the misconceptions that Muslims have of Christians. I'm a bit naughty here, because I make these slightly line up in a way that takes you nicely into the gospel. But I start with the one that you've talked about, that a lot of Muslims think that, the West is Christian, and so have so many misconceptions about it, either because, as I say, they just in their heads think the West is Christian, or they come from Muslim contexts where the state and the religion are sort of the same thing, and then they get vague idea there are bishops in the House of Lords and an established church and the Queen and the head of the church and all this other stuff. So I like to disentangle that one, and talk about the fact that being a Christian is that personal commitment to follow Christ. Then I talk about the misconception that many Muslims have about the Bible. Many Muslims have been taught to believe the Bible has been corrupted. That's an idea you hear put around in lots of mosques, lots of Muslim, books and so forth will teach Muslims that.
Corrupted
so
in what way?
Well, so the issue is this, Paul, that Muhammad claimed that he was preaching and teaching the same message as Jesus and all the prophets who'd come before him. The Quran, you see that idea repeated in the Quran time and time again. But when Muhammad was preaching and teaching, his public ministry ran from 610 to 632 AD. At that point in history, the Bible had not yet been translated into Arabic. And in Arabia was also pretty much an oral society at that point. So basically nobody could check. Then when Muhammad dies, and the Islamic conquests begin, and Islam expands rapidly out of Arabia and begins conquering former Christian territory, North Africa, for example, and elsewhere. Very quickly, Muslim scholars got their hands on the Bible, began debating with Christians, and discovered, horror of horrors, that the Bible and the Quran were not the same message. They were profoundly different. And thus they were forced to a choice. Either they had to say that Muhammad had got it profoundly wrong, or, and this is the route they took about 200 years into the Islamic era, okay, the Bible's been corrupted, it's been changed. Jews and Christians have changed it. The original message preached by Jesus, preached by Moses or whatever, was the same as the Quran. And so many Muslims today have been taught that idea. And so I always like to sort of, tackle that when I'm addressing particularly a Muslim audience. Even helping them see where it came from in history is interesting, because the Quran doesn't make that accusation. And then lastly, I always want to raise the misunderstandings that Muslims have around Jesus, because of course Muslims believe that what has happened is Christians have taken Jesus, who they believe to have been just a man, just a prophet, and we have started worshipping him. We have elevated a man to deity and committed what is Islam the ultimate sin. They are not aware of the claims that Jesus made, which led Christians to conclude this. Christians didn't just randomly worship Jesus. It was a response to what Jesus said and taught and did. And Muslims are usually unaware of that.
And in a sense, you can understand why those misconceptions, a corrupted message, a revering of Jesus to deification that he didn't either ask for or warrant, you can understand why they would cause offense to someone who is a committed, devout Muslim, in the same way that the similar ideas might cause offense to us. So it's important to treat those perspectives with respect, and yet at the same time to bring truth. Absolutely.
I mean, almost the way you asked the word respect, you almost sound you sort of weren't sure if you were pushing the envelope a bit. I agree with you totally. In the same way that I respect my atheist friends. I've had the privilege of dialoguing with a few leading atheists, most famously Peter Singer, probably one of the world's most well-known atheist ethicists. Peter believes stuff that, I think is, absolutely left field crazy. I'd say that if he was here. But I would respect it because he believes it passionately. And the same when it comes to my Muslim friends. I think you can respect the person without respecting the belief. That what's interesting, that's got collapsed in our culture today, which has caused no end of problems culturally. It's persons who are worthy of respect. Ideas we can disagree with wholeheartedly, but because I want to, at the end of the day, this is not some battle of ideas. It's not about winning an argument. It's about winning the person. And if whatever a Muslim tells me, I always want to try and understand why they believe that. In fact, a really helpful book in this respect is, you may have come across, there's a late friend of mine died a few years ago now, called Nabil Qureshi. Nabil was a Muslim convert from Muslim Islam to Christianity, and his book, his testimony, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, was a New York Times bestseller. And if listeners haven't ever read it, hugely recommend getting a copy. Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, because what Nabil does so brilliantly at the start of that book is he helps you understand why he was so passionate about Islam. There's a lot of testimonies, from people from other faiths where, almost sounds like you wonder why they'd have ever believed it. But Nabil helps you understand why he was passionate, what he was proud of as a Muslim, why he thought this stood up and was robust. And then as the story goes on, you begin to see the cracks develop. I think if we're not careful, we can sort of con ourselves that my Muslim friends are sitting there going, oh, my beliefs don't really make sense. I just can't wait for the Christian to come and tell me the true way. Whereas, for our Muslim friends, they believe we're the ones who are deceived. And let's say I respect that. Disagree, but respect it.
So what are some of the questions then that we should be preparing ourselves to answer? I suppose what it is, if I'm building, like you've talked about, if I'm building a friendship with my Islamic neighbor and we are starting to have conversations, what are the sort of areas that are common questions that Muslims might have about my faith?
Well, we've touched on a few, so we can go into a little more detail. And obviously, one question may be, why Christians are so kind of lax in their morality and their standards, because if they assume that the West is Christian, they will look at some of the nonsense we see in the media and assume that we are in favor of, pornography, lax sexual standards, drug taking, goodness knows whatever. And it can be very helpful to sort of, be ready to sort of talk about the fact this is not a Christian country. What I have found actually helpful is, given that the internet has spread all kinds of nonsense all over the place, is to sort of point out that, just as they would be upset by if you took some example of something that's gone wrong in the Muslim world and assume that's Islam. It's interesting that I read something recently that, Google every year publish statistics for, searches around the world and what terms are searched from where. Some of the stuff that's searched from the Middle East often tops the record for searches for really quite nasty sexual stuff on the internet. It would be wrong for me to go, therefore, right, okay, this Islam means this. Equally, things like terrorism, actually, if you're talking to a more moderate Muslim and say, presumably you'd be outraged if I assumed that Islam equaled terrorism because, bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, Saudis, and my Muslim friend would go, well, of course, absolutely, right. Likewise, in the same way, we have the same issue here. So be ready for that one. The Bible is the next one, I'd say, Paul. I mentioned that before. I think we need to be ready to address that one. In 1 Peter 3:15, it says, always be prepared to give an answer for the reason for the hope that you have. So with our Muslim friends, we need to be prepared. So be ready for what happens if they say the Bible's not reliable. There are lots of great books you can read on that. Go to the Solas website, lots of resources. Or the approach I sometimes take, very simple approach, even though I've studied a lot of this stuff for years and could draw on heavier stuff. Sometimes the simple stuff is the most effective. Sometimes when a Muslim friend says to me they believe the Bible has been corrupted, I will look at them and say, okay, so you're telling me that the scriptures that came before the Quran are corrupted, changed, unreliable. Yes, they say. Okay, help me out. Did the Bible become corrupted because Allah was too weak to protect his scripture? Or was he too callous that he couldn't be bothered? Humans needed this, but he was doing something else. He was, he was off playing, cribbage with the angels or something. Which was it? Do you believe in a God who is callous or a God who is powerless? That sort of forces them onto the horns of a dilemma, because there really isn't an alternative option there. And then allows me to press in slightly and say, look, I believe in a God whose word stands forever. I believe in a God who is well capable of protecting Scripture. I think you believe in that same God too, but you might just want to be careful about the arguments you use, because you've described to me a God who sounds pretty incompetent, frankly. And that can be interesting to sort of push things that way. And then with Jesus is the other one as well. Paul is the third one. Obviously Muslims, have very different beliefs about us to Jesus. So again, need to be ready to explain why it is that you believe Jesus to be who he is. One thing I will do there is often use that as an opportunity for a brief Bible study. And the gospel I will often use, and it's nice because it's short, is Mark's gospel. Because in Mark chapter 1, you have John the Baptist preparing the way in the desert. And then in the book of Isaiah, which Mark is quoting from there, it's Yahweh who comes down that way that's being prepared. In Mark's chapter 1, it's Jesus. Mark chapter 2, we have the famous story of the paralytic lowered through the roof. Remember the story? Jesus forgives the man's sins. The teachers of the law go nuts. I often turn to Muslims and say, why do you think they got upset? And Muslims will often get it, well, because he forgave the guy's sin and he got it.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And see what Jesus does next. Chapter 3, we have Jesus declaring himself to be Lord of the Sabbath. So that's Lord of space and time. It's Lord over the very sacred structure of time itself. And again, the religious leaders get it and go nuts. Example after example through Mark's gospel, the stilling of the storm and so on, all of these things. And then often say to Muslims, look, culminating, of course, in Jesus before Caiaphas, the high priest, where Jesus is asked, are you the Son of the Most High? And Jesus doesn't say no, which is the obvious answer to say if you're on trial for blasphemy, but he quotes that passage from Daniel about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, which the chief priest rends his robes and says, crucify the guy. Then I say to Muslims, if he stayed dead, we'd have had a dead Jewish blasphemer. He made these outrageous claims about himself, and it got him crucified, quite rightly, and he stayed dead. But he didn't stay dead, did he? The gospel is very clear that he rose dramatically from the grave, vindicating everything he'd said. That, I say to Muslims, that is why Christians believe who Jesus is. It's the claims, it's the actions, it's the deeds backed up by the resurrection. So be ready to walk your Muslim friend through that. You can do Bible studies with Muslims. Doing Bible studies with atheists is tough. Muslims are open to reading scripture together. Use that opportunity.
And when you talk in those sorts of terms, I suspect that many Christians will think, oh no, I could never invite a Muslim into my house to do a Bible study. It would get them in trouble with the mosque. It would get me all sorts of things said about me, and it might even get me in trouble with church. Why are you mixing with these Muslims? I could never do that. But the truth is, your experience, and we've talked around this before, but your experience is that actually there is often a greater willingness within the Muslim community to hear us than there is for us as Christians to hear them.
Oh my, yes. One of my favorite stories in this, I got a friend of mine who for some years had worked with a Muslim at work, and finally decided after some years of working with a guy that, maybe he ought to invite him and his wife around for a meal. So the Muslim colleague and his wife came and had dinner with my friend and his wife. They had a lovely time. And it wasn't long before the conversation over dinner got onto faith-based things. It came up very kind of naturally in the course of conversation. They had an amazing kind of evening together that ran late into the night. But what was interesting is they were leaving at the end of the evening. The Muslim colleague at the door turned to my friend and said, well, thank you so much for inviting us. He said, I've lived in this country for 25, 30 years. This is the first time I've ever been inside a Christian home. And it kind of blew my friend away, really, because, that somebody could be in this country for that long and not meet a Christian. But then the fact that he'd also worked with him for 10 years and hadn't invited him. So, it was very easy. And my friend said the conversation just naturally got round to faith things. It just sort of came up. Really. So Muslims are very open to this. And on the study piece, one way into this instant, if you have Muslim friends and you're getting to know them, the first thing I'd say is hospitality. Don't leap straight into let's have a Bible study. Why not just, for listeners, if you've got a Muslim friend or neighbor, why not start by inviting them for a meal? And if you're not sure what to cook because of halal stuff, serve vegetarian, go vegan or vegetarian for the night. Can't go wrong. But once you get to know them a little bit, I found a very natural way is to actually do a Quran and Bible study. Say to them, look, I don't know much about the Quran. I guess you probably don't know much about the Bible. Why don't next time we meet for coffee, why don't you bring your favorite Quran passage and tell me a bit about it? Because I'd love to know what it says and why you are drawn to it. And I'll tell you my favorite Bible passage and we'll talk about that for a bit. Really, really easy. And trust me, when that happens, you normally spend more time talking about the Bible, because Muslims don't actually do Quran study in the way we do Bible study. So if you know even a little bit about the Bible, you'll have something to talk about. But one resource actually we should mention, Paul, is for folks who want to go a bit deeper into like befriending Muslims, there's a wonderful organization called the Mahabba Network, and kind of thing. Paul, you know, I've got sort of friends who are involved with that. Brilliant resource and networks of Christians who are working on befriending Muslims. So mahabbanetwork.com, MAHABBA network.com. And there's lots of resources, opportunities to get you befriending Muslims. But yeah, start with hospitality. Take that step of actually getting to know a Muslim.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because all the things that you've said as we've gone through this together, I mean, the basic premise at the beginning that we had was that Christians should think more seriously about reaching, befriending, connecting with their Muslim neighbours. But often we're afraid to. And yet, if we are prepared, if we are open, if we are willing to see and respect people as people, rather than get hung up on the ideas that they disagree with us about, that actually this starts to become just very natural. And this sort of relation-centric evangelism becomes as much about building the relationship as it does about creating the opportunity for evangelism. It just flows together.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what's interesting, as you sort of suggested there, that applies not just to engaging Muslims, but to engaging anybody. You know, I do a lot of teaching and training on evangelism, and we're always saying to people at the end of those sessions, in terms of, you know, what are the next steps? I always say to people, begin praying that the Lord would, you know, open your eyes to people who are probably right under your nose, friends, neighbours, colleagues, classmates, people you already know that you may not have thought about. You know, you don't have to sort of think about, you know, going and doing street evangelism in the next town. It may be right in your workplace. There are opportunities to do it in a more natural kind of way. And then at the same time, on the Solas website last year for 2021, we ran a series where every other week we interviewed a Christian in a different line of work. It was a series we called Frontlines. And we spoke to everyone from pilots, engineers, teachers, cleaners, police officers, a whole amazing range of men and women. But what amazed me as we interviewed people about how they talked about their faith at work and what they were doing in terms of being salt and light in their workday worlds, was that theme you've picked up there came through. All of them had worked out how to just be natural Christians. There weren't people doing, you know, sort of standing up on the, you know, on the table in the cafeteria at lunchtime shouting about Jesus. They'd found ways to befriend their colleagues, serve their colleagues. Some were running alpha courses at work. Some were, you know, all kinds of different things. But every single one was a kind of very natural approach to evangelism. So yeah, I think that's the thing. And when you take that approach too, the other thing I think is interesting with that, Paul, is it also works for your personality. Because the danger is, you know, if you're nervous about evangelism, you look at people who've got loud mouths, you know, listen to you and I having this conversation. They go, oh, it's all right for Paul and Andy because they could talk the hind legs of a donkey and persuade it to go for a walk afterwards. But, you know, I think of my mother, for example, who's been a Christian for years, but is a very gifted evangelist who would be horrified to hear me describe her that way. She doesn't think she is, but she's really, really good at hospitality and befriending people. And she, in her own quiet way, the influence she's been is incredible. But her style is totally different to mine. And that's what I say I think we need to do. Pray for the opportunities, look at the style, the way that God's wired us, and then be saying, Lord, you know, Holy Spirit, how can you work through the opportunities I already have in my everyday life? And then, as you say, evangelism becomes part of our DNA rather than the sort of, you know, thing we do occasionally when the pastor asks the volunteers to do door to door on a Saturday afternoon or something.
So what, and a final thought from you in this then, what would you say to those who are hearing you say that and all they are seeing are the headlines of Christians who have been sacked or disciplined or challenged at work because they shared their faith with, I suppose in many ways, particularly perhaps a Muslim colleague, but also perhaps a Hindu or a Jewish colleague, and have been accused of, well, virtually bordering on hate speak because they challenged that person's faith?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say, Paul, is going, you know, I think it's important that folks hear, you know, those stories are very few and far between. In fact, I can't immediately think of any. I've got a little file of, you know, occasional horror stories like, you know, that poor lady who, wore the cross at British Airways and got in trouble, or there's a nurse I know a few years ago got, fired for say offering to pray with a patient, and there was the famous Christian Baker case in Ireland. I can't actually immediately think of many of people sharing their faith with folks from other backgrounds, which is interesting, kind of thing. And obviously what often will happen online is someone who will hear such a story and then it gets circulated and something gets magnified. So I don't think it happens that often, is the first thing. Second thing, I'm a big believer in what matters is how you do it. So absolutely, if you go in all guns blazing and make a huge, great nuisance of yourself, then stuff may happen. But of course, if you get persecuted for your faith, doesn't necessarily mean it's because you're being faithful. It could be just because you're being a bit clueless. And I think the way into evangelism in the workplace, I think the first thing you can do, and I borrow this phrase from a friend of mine, fly a faith flag at work. Begin by letting people know that you're a Christian. One good way of doing that really easily is the notorious "what did you do on the weekend" conversation. A lot of Christians, if we're honest with ourselves, we love talking about Saturday. We sort of cough and splutter over Sunday morning. We talk about Sunday afternoon with kids. But I think if we were much more public about the fact we went to a great church service on Sunday, it was fantastic. I love being with other Christians and stuff. People would go, "Oh gosh, Christians are, really excited about church," first thing. Then with those from other faith backgrounds like Muslims, start by taking an interest. And look, if your colleague doesn't want to talk about their faith, respect that. Just pray for the opportunity. But if you take a real interest and actually build that friendship, then you're going to build a context, I think, in which it's much easier to have those faith conversations without stepping on landmines. And then lastly, as well, I'm a great believer, we've touched a bit on this as we've gone today, on the power of questions. Rather than saying, "Well, I think you're wrong and here are 3 reasons." If you simply say, "You know what, one of the things I've often wondered is," and turn it into a question, things are very different, because you can always turn around and say, I never came out and said, I don't believe Islam is true. You just become a Christian. I did ask the following question. Interestingly, in years of working with Muslims, Paul, I've never once had a Muslim say they're offended in anything I've said. I've had Muslims say they disagree. I've had Muslims say they think I'm going to hell, which is not an insult. They're concerned that I am. On their view of the world. And so I think if we go in prayerfully and listening and willing to talk, to listen as much as we talk, and rely on Christ and the Spirit, I think there are less dangers out there than people imagine. I think it's one of the little rumors the enemy likes to spread around, actually, that you can't have these conversations. One last thought on this, by the way, it reminds me, when I was in Canada, we tried at one university, we wanted to put on a dialogue event, which was going to involve a Hindu, a Muslim, an atheist, and a Christian. And the university authorities got wind of this and tried to shut it down. They didn't want this discussion happening because they were afraid, it might cause tension. And it was only when a representative of the Atheist Society, the Muslim Society, the Hindu Society, the Christian Society went to see the Vice Chancellor and went, "We are all friends. We are united. We want to have this event." He suddenly realized that actually maybe it's a good thing to have people be friends across barriers and talk about their differences. And I think actually in the modern workplace, if we can show actually Christians want to create a space in which people can talk about these things. I remember actually a friend of mine who works for a large company in the City of London, a couple of years ago, going to HR to ask if he could put an Alpha course on. And the only feedback was, "Well, absolutely, but obviously it would be open to anybody, right?" And when he said, "Oh, yes, it's open to Muslims and Hindus and atheists, it's open to anybody," they're like, "Oh, absolutely. And you can even advertise it in the company newsletter." Their only concern about the Alpha course was that, it wasn't going to be Christians only, which we thought was quite amusing. So I think there's a lot more openness than we realize.
Now, you mentioned, because we need to draw this to a close, and thank you for your time today, but you mentioned that there are a lot of resources accessible through Solas, and it's only fair. He is, after all, the director of Solas, Dr. Andy Bannister. Just give us the details of the website so that we can access it.
So, the website, Paul, is Solas, SOLAS, -CPC, so for Centre for Public Christianity, that's our full title, .org, solas-cpc.org. Or if people can't remember that, put my name or Solas into Google. And the first thing you put Solas in, you'll come up with Safety of Life at Sea. That's not us. I have to stress, if you are drowning, call those guys, don't call us. but we're about second or third on Google. And there's all kinds of things there, Paul. People can find videos, articles, stuff suitable for sharing with non-Christian friends, stuff that help get you more equipped in evangelism, stories of others doing it. And it's all free. Anything on our website, totally free to use. You don't have to ask our permission. Share it, copy it, do whatever you want with it. Our prayer is that it just helps equip you to share your faith in Christ with your atheist friend, Hindu friend, or in this case, Muslim friend.
Let's be honest. Part of the reason that we hold back from reaching out to those around us is because we are worried about how it will be received. Worried that we'll upset people, worried that we'll provoke a row, worried that we might provoke some negative reaction that blows back on us at work or whatever. And yet, isn't that because there's a part of us is thinking about reaching people around us as though it were some project that we had to do? It was our duty. Actually, if we can start to see those around us as gifts of God into our lives, people that we can get to know, people that we can befriend, people who will bring things into our experience that benefit and develop and grow us, and people into whose lives we can bring our positives, our fruit sown to enhance their lives. Doesn't it become then obvious that by being friends and just living our faith in a natural and yet intentional and overt way, let's not shy away from it, we create the space for mutual respect, mutual understanding, and the opportunity for some of those false assumptions on both sides to be broken down and the Holy Spirit to do his work. You've been listening to UCB Life Issues. My guest today, Dr. Andy Bannister, Director of Solas. Andy, great to speak to you. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks again.
I'm Paul Hammond. Why don't you join me next week for another Life Issues? Good night.